As these two lonely souls spend more time together, they decide to use each other as a substitute for the one they truly love, sharing physical intimacy with one another in order to stave off their loneliness. That's a piece of the summary of Kuzu no Honkai on my anime list, and reading that summary is what led me to go amusedly inform my girlfriend of how this interesting-looking upcoming anime sorta reminded me of our own relationship when first browsing the season's offerings a while back. Yeah, my story here is gonna be a little dark, but considering the subject at hand that it pertains to, I think that's really only fitting. The element of Kuzu no Honkai that really struck a chord with me was the self-awareness of it all, especially in light of the mind-numbing ignorance that's all too often the norm for these types of anime. There's plenty of oversights and failures to completely understand themselves and those around them, to be certain, but at the core of Kuzu no Honkai is a cast of characters that each have their own desires and are setting out to fulfill them. Emotional trauma inflicted upon themselves or others in the process be damned. Mugi and Hanabi are drowning their sorrows in each other's saliva, and are happy for that relationship to revolve around that explicitly and without pretension, at least until it begins evolving into something more. As a pair of introspective people who are robotic enough to take an interest in attempting to explore and break down the mechanics of our feelings and emotions, my girlfriend and I had already wondered about the exchange going on within our own relationship. In exploring our various hang-ups, we'd concluded that part of what made the relationship work was her somewhat compulsive desires for affection and willingness to be manipulative in order to fulfill them, and those attempts of hers providing me the kind of emotional validation and comfort I needed, primarily expressing affection to someone who desired it of me. I certainly viewed this as somewhat intriguing, and of course technically not the optimal grounds for a relationship, but I'm just wired such that even knowing all this I really had no issues, since unhealthy as it may ultimately be, it does get that job done. And yes, you have every right to see me as strange for viewing emotional comfort as just one more need to be fulfilled, and taking comfort in being able to acquire a source of it and check that off the list. I don't know how relatable this will be to those viewers who aren't psychopaths, but just like these characters, I will simultaneously be legitimately experiencing an emotion, and dispassionately analyzing that experience. Feeling the sensation of loneliness, but then also pondering why exactly that's the case, and being somewhat amused by the curious nature of that loneliness. And the detachedness of one's headspace from the events unfolding is communicated perfectly by the use of paneling throughout the series. In some instances, it's used to highlight something that really stands out to or shocks the characters in a relatively understated manner. Kuzu no Honkai manages to maintain its largely grounded visual style for the bulk of the series by not having those more cartoony shoujo effects appear on screen. A lightning bolt, or the background suddenly changing to some image of a stormy sea to reflect the distress these sights cause. And instead simply having sources of this distress pop out in this fairly low-key diegetic manner. A sort of first-person perspective where the character's vision narrows and focuses on that one disturbing sight. Even more remarkable is the separation of those headspaces from the events occurring. The facades being performed here are Hanabi looking on passively while Akane chats with Kanai. But the really significant action going down is this power play between her and Hanabi. And when Hanabi walks away, Akane continues looking forward to maintain that facade, while we're made aware of where her attention is truly focused. When Hanabi breaks down later, that paneling is absent. The separation of feelings and facade being of course unnecessary when she's all alone and there's no one to be putting up a front for. Similarly, they don't make an appearance in her confrontation of Akane here, an exchange too frank for that deceit to be necessary. The one character for whom those shoujo visual elements do invade the series is putting on the performance of that romantic ideal, and while many have noted her seeming incongruence with the general tone of the series, at least upon her introduction, that is simply yet another facade that is as artificial as these elements seem in contrast to the rest of the series. When it does slip into a slightly goofier visual style, it's generally because this performative aspect is coming up again, and a contrast being created, headspaces once again being cordoned off from the events as they play out. You won't find a single entry for the series on Sakugaboru, but the visuals here are very polished and consistent, the delicate texturing everything has lending it both a sense of gritty reality and transient fragility, and there's tons of moments of subtle, really effective character acting throughout, meaning that this stellar direction is elevated by a solid execution of that vision, instead of being undermined by a failure to do so. It was really a joy to see my predictions for the series ring true, and all too relatable to witness these characters running a cost-benefit analysis of what their own relationships were getting them. The series is fairly popular, and I imagine elements of it like the theoretically loveless sex purely for physical gratification, or unrequited love, are ones that have a fairly wide resonance. But both of those are fairly alien to me, and instead it's these seemingly dispassionate conversations between Hanabi and Mugi about the limitations of what they can realistically provide each other, and how should they get that partner that can actually satisfy their emotional needs, they should be prepared to abandon this relationship that resonated with me, this being another topic that had arisen in my own conversations with my girlfriend. The levity in Kuzu no Honkai is yet another aspect of it that's handled absolutely marvelously. The interactions in places like the beginning of episode 8 are legitimately some of the most hilarious and adorable scenes I've ever witnessed in anime, in spite of being fairly low-key. They're scattered throughout the series, and they generally manage to hit this level of high effectiveness. In the episode just prior, Mugi was going on this fairy tale date with an obsessed childhood friend that he had no romantic investment in just to sate her desires, and Hanabi had the remarkably sober line, "I have no friends," after trying and failing to exploit a playboy for some personal emotional validation, and noting that she can't go see her one former friend Echan. The whole sexual assault thing kinda put a damper on that relationship. There's just something immensely elevating about the contrast between how incredibly dark and heavy the shit they're grappling with is, and the fact that, yeah, there's still people who are trying to put out the image of being okay, as they munch on Pocky and shoot quips back and forth, with their traumas and hang-ups merely resulting in a fatalistic detachedness in the backs of their minds, and moments of crushing emotional distress when they finally become unable to keep pushing those underlying issues aside. Those moments aren't all-encompassing, though, and we're just as likely to get a simple as we are to get one of those breakdowns. This level of general depression being the baseline, preventing the weight from being taken away from those heavier hitting scenes by keeping them from being an unremarkable occurrence. I don't think my own relationship is in nearly as dark a place, at least not on my end. We know what we want, are getting at least some of it, and aren't having to make huge sacrifices in order to benefit from the relationship. Some of the largest problems are the underlying issues outside of the relationship itself that lends it some instability, namely my girlfriend's home situation, anxiety, and potential suicidal tendencies. Whereas with Hanabi and Mugi, that relationship itself is the source of a number of their issues. Even the instances where I've talked her out of running away from home because she feels like she simply can't continue living there have this strange dynamic, where we both know that if it truly seemed like that was the best option available, I wouldn't try to stop her. If I was predisposed towards being any other way, she wouldn't be putting up with me. We're left waiting for that moment when it does get that bad, and all the affection I can convey isn't enough to keep her off the streets. It's been 3 days now since she was last online, and her generally active Twitter has been silent, which hasn't happened before, and I'm legitimately left wondering if she did finally run away, or perhaps even killed herself. It's unlikely, I think. That same self-aware bluntness means she'd probably let me know before doing either of those, and of course that too has been something we've discussed, her planning on letting me know of a suicide attempt before going through with it, right before we jump back to sarcastic quips of course. But that potentiality is ever present, and something I'm forced to consider as the time between her last activity grows longer and longer. And those considerations of mine having a level of detached intellectual curiosity that rivals or even surpasses their emotional distress is part of the draw that this series holds for me. And look at all those rose petals in the OP! This show knows me so well. It'd be narcissistic to merely focus upon those elements of Kuzu no Honkai with such a personal tie to my own life though, because there's other points of interest here. The varying desires of the cast and what is required to fulfill them forming a complex web that engenders all of their interactions is really well constructed. What's so fascinating about a series that is driven by desire, especially when populated by developing teens, is the way in which those desires evolve, or how the cast goes about finding something that can in some way fill the void when exactly what they want is simply beyond their reach. The bulk of these characters have a relatively simple underlying desire, the requital of their love for their particular crush, but they've all got to find a different way to make do. Echan contents herself with being a manipulator who will drive Hanabi into darkness because she feels like Hanabi will come back to her if all else fails, and loves Hanabi even in a broken and bittered state. In her eyes, her love of Hanabi exceeds anyone else's, and she's willing to ruin Hanabi to a point where she's the only one who could love her. Mocha tries to take what she can get, an indulgence of her desires from a romantically uninterested Mugi, and be happy with just that, and at this point she'll give anything and value everything. Akane is the real wrench in the works here, being someone whose desire is to snatch up the affections of those who are desired, depriving people of their own fulfillment in a world full of such feelings. Her somewhat inherently sadistic nature casts Akane as a villain, but how bad is she really, relative to everyone else? Echan's obviously not a good guy here either, but even discounting those two, we're still left wondering. Everyone's desires here necessitate the pain of others in order to fulfill. Akane feeds off suffering in general, Kanai wants to hook up with her, which leaves Hanabi heartbroken, and being uninterested in Echan, the fulfillment of Hanabi's desires would hurt her. Mugi's affections being returned would leave Mocha out to dry, and of course if she did get Mugi to herself, that'd leave him dissatisfied. There's nothing more revolting than the affection of someone you're completely disinterested in, is there? Hanabi's query from episode 1 remains relevant, as she and this cast of characters know better than anyone else. Such affections will be inconveniences at best, and at their worst can ruin a person. As was concluded pretty early on by many people, there is simply no universal happy ending for these characters that can result from this web as it's been established. And if things do ever end up settling down, some people will have to resign themselves to having those desires go forever unrequited, and that's rather interesting. It isn't inherently tragic and overwrought. Those resignations can be made and the characters who make them can move on, but it's a situation where everyone is inherently causing pain to someone else, and if anything, the villain is best poised to escape without getting hurt. This bad ending is fated, and yet it isn't really framed as tragic, just normal and inescapable. You don't often get series that take a negative stance but aren't simply, look how terrible life is, or can be, and instead opt for this sort of low-key, understated, yeah, life can suck, and there are some situations where people will be sad no matter how things play out, because it lacks the inherent appeal of more uplifting takes, and the gut-punch impact of that heavily gloomy approach. Kuzu no Honkai isn't depressing or heartbreaking. It's just kinda sad. Not that I haven't enjoyed it immensely myself, because the uniqueness of these characters' interactions is a result of the strange circumstances surrounding them, and just how well realized all of them are is a really satisfying experience, when conveyed as wonderfully as it is here. I can't relate to how damn attractive they all are, but boy does the way these people think resonate with my own thought process. And upon finishing this script, my girlfriend just started tweeting again, so it seems like, at least in this place, at least for now, things do turn out alright. You can help them to turn out even better by supporting me on Patreon, joining Bill, Sam, Izumi69, Remy Goldschmidt, Joji Matthews, Culver James Kamai, Chris Wagner, Teencho37, Matchbox Matt, MathWiz97, Zach Penrith, Greg Greenwell, Cherry Boy Writer, Car Keys, Valkion, Mickey's Stopwatch, and all of my other patrons in helping to enable and improve this content.